Welcome to China 411. My name is Huang Zhenyu, or as my friends call me, Z. With that said, I do want to welcome my very good friend Ken Wilcox, who's our co-moderator, and our guest for the day, Armand Zand. Ken?
So my story is totally different from Z's. Totally different. First of all, I'm at least twice his age. And secondly, I'm not Chinese. I didn't start going to China until about 16 years ago. It was the first time I went to China. And then after 10 years as CEO of Silicon Valley Bank, I decided to retire. But instead of going home, my wife and I went to China. The bank actually wanted us to go to China to start a joint venture bank, a joint venture between Silicon Valley Bank and the Chinese government to focus on technology companies, especially startups in China. This relationship between China and the US and normal relationships between Chinese people and American people often can be very, very difficult. In the first instance, we can really enjoy each other's personalities and enjoy each other's company. But when it comes time to talking about really important issues, our perspectives are often very, very different. So different that it's really hard to understand the way the other person thinks, and that's in both directions. So that's why we've got this little series, China 411, to try to figure out how the other side thinks. And so our guest today is an old and dear friend of both of us, actually, Armand Zand. So I think Armand is very, very international and does a better job than most people of understanding the way other people think. And today, he's now working at an incubator, accelerator kind of an organization in San Francisco called Rocket Space that is now beginning to build relationships with China. So we have Armand with us today to talk about this whole business of early stage technology companies in China and what they're doing there, what they do when they come to the US, all of that set of issues around early stage companies, China, US, and the exchange between the two.
So what's your take about entrepreneurship going on in China, especially given your knowledge of Silicon Valley? How do you compare and contrast it?
Well, the question of China entrepreneurship. When we first went to China as an organization in the late 1990s, China entrepreneurship in the technology space had already taken off, and there was several what we call Web 1.0, Internet 1.0 companies that had already gotten off the ground. And Silicon Valley Bank was actually a leader, a trailblazer in taking VCs from the US to China for the first time in 2005. In fact, we actually, Ken, if you remember, we put VCs on an airplane and took them to China for them to visit. And in our office on Huaihai Road, we housed several VC firms. Now, since then, like most things in the Valley, there's been multiple cycles. And the China VC and entrepreneurship has really taken, I would call it almost a third wave most recently. In that, first and foremost, what we're seeing on the ground is that companies are now taking money locally a lot more. Until about a year or 2 years ago, most companies, like yours, in China took money in US dollars. Today, a lot of Chinese companies, specifically in the internet, mobile, e-commerce space, anything to do with media, are now much more taking their funds in local renminbi, with local renminbi investors. And that's really changed, I think, the landscape. And it's really changed the entrepreneur mindset in China. And I think that's really the biggest change.
So that word mindset, Armand, I really want to press you on it. What is the psychology of a Chinese entrepreneur?
First and foremost, I have to caveat with the fact that I think as foreigners, and maybe we can all disagree or agree about this, I don't think as foreigners we're ever really going to understand the mindset of a Chinese entrepreneur. What I do understand is that speaking just the Mandarin language itself, or the Chinese language.
But what if it's a person, and today we see 500,000 expats living in Shanghai. Many of them are actually bringing their young kids. Many of them are actually having kids in China. That generation, right? Maybe they look like Ken. Maybe they look like, Armand. Do you think they'll truly understand China?
I think if they're being raised in a household that still primarily speaks English and primarily has Western values, I think it's going to be very difficult. But I think the reverse is true in the U.S., where people like me and you who immigrated to the U.S., even though we still might live in our foreign culture household, because we go to school here, because we went to university here, because we worked here, we're much more able to assimilate much closer to the American culture. Partly it has to do maybe with the fact that the American culture is also diverse in itself, whereas the Chinese culture is not as diverse, or at least it's very homogeneous in that sense, right? Versus the American culture, well, we're all from different places. You and I are from different places.
I also had a chance to deal with the Chinese government negotiating on behalf of Intel. And what a lot of the Chinese officials, every time I meet them, would say, you don't understand China. And what I find most fascinating is most Americans actually say, yeah, we don't understand China. And I often wonder, is that really true? Is that really true? Because the fact is, do Chinese people understand China? And that's the question I always get, because I find that China is evolving so quickly. I think most Chinese people are getting the handle of what China is and will become. And so it's fascinating because you are in the space, entrepreneurship, that's all about the future, building the future, right? Talk to us about these entrepreneurs that you spend every day with, for the past decade or more.
What we see in China in terms of the entrepreneurship culture is, first and foremost, Chinese entrepreneurs tend to be very impatient. And they want to move in a pace that's much faster than what we see in the US. We have companies that in China that were very impatient to reach cash flow break even, to get to cash flow positivity, and to get their company to the next step very quickly. It's a different mindset than in the US. I spent a lot of time, and we've had some conversations about why are they in such a hurry? Why do they first look to a revenue model before the product is fully built out? Why are they looking to get cash flow before the R&D process is completed? My personal opinion is because Chinese entrepreneurs don't necessarily believe that the good times are going to last forever. And there's a sense of distrust, not just amongst themselves, but with the whole system, right? A lot of Chinese entrepreneurs that I've met believe that equity is almost free money. To raise money from an investor, it's almost free. It's just there for me to take. And I better do something with it. And I better catch up and make my money as soon as I can, because it's not going to last forever. And that has to do with, as I said, a sense of distrust in the whole system of the way it's built, as well as the distrust in the government. And so there is this intense speed and desire to get things done as fast as possible. And I think that's one of the things that hinders their ability to innovate above and beyond a revenue model or above and beyond a business model. In the US, there's a general trust of the system, of the ecosystem that's Silicon Valley. That yes, we're going to go through cycles, but at the end of the day, the VC money coming in, us having exits and IPOs and M&A, this is a long-term game. So it's okay if I invest 5 years building a product that may never have a commercialization opportunity. Everybody in China is in a hurry. And it's not just in the companies. You see that on the street. You see that the way people are walking, the way people are driving, the way people are eating, the way people are interacting.
Well, I do have to say, I see skyscrapers and subway stations being built in a matter of months. Whereas when I was in Boston, they had this big dig that lasted
14 years.
14 years, right?
Yeah.
And
So I agree with you. I just moved back to the U.S. last month, and I take BART from Berkeley to San Francisco, and the escalator in the BART station has been broken for an entire month, and I realized that would never happen in China. That probably would have been fixed the same day. I spent a lot of time, years, trying to figure out why is everyone in such a hurry? What is the rush? And I remember when I was a kid, I used to eat really fast. And my mom used to always say, "Who's chasing you? You know, slow down. No one's chasing you." And I kind of felt that when I was in China, that there was always a sense in the entrepreneurs that someone is chasing them, or something is chasing them, or that this opportunity is going to come to an end. And maybe that's why skyscrapers are built so fast, right? Because if someone's going to put money into development of a skyscraper, they don't want to see their return in 3 years. They don't know where they're going to be in 3 years. They want their money in 3 months.
I think Chinese people in general feel that they were doing well for 4,000 plus years. And then starting in, I guess, 1843, when the Western powers came into China wanting to open up Chinese markets and ended up at war with China, Chinese people feel that they've gone through 150 or now 75 years, I guess, of what they call humiliation, but also lack of progress, and that now they've got a lot of catching up to do.
I think I would tend to agree with half of what you said. And only because the entrepreneurs that we're talking about, they're in the age range of 20 to 40.
So they don't even think about this stuff.
I don't think they think about that. I think they think about the last half of what you said, the catching up. And I don't think it's necessarily catching up from what they left. It's not a comparison to themselves, but it's a comparison to the rest of the world, right? We all know that Chinese are very aspirational, and they want to live a lifestyle similar to the West, the way they consume, the way they travel, the way they learn. So the catch-up is not necessarily from where they left, but to where everybody else is right now.
Right. So what about innovation, right? Because so many of the most successful startups in Silicon Valley are populated by Chinese or Indian entrepreneurs or engineers. Does China itself have that kind of environment for true innovation?
You know, that's a great question. That is really probably one of the most important ones, because we hear this over and over again in Silicon Valley. We've heard it now for 10, 15 years that Chinese can't innovate. All they can do is copy.
Exactly.
So what are you seeing? Do you think that's true, or what do you think?
I absolutely believe that Chinese entrepreneurs have the ability to innovate, as long as they have the resources to do so. An investor in the US is very happy giving you $20 million to take 2 years to develop a product that may or may not ever see commercialization. And there is tons of VCs around Sand Hill Road that say, oh, this company's got a ton of users, and they're still iterating on that product. They don't have a revenue model, but that's okay because they've got a 500 million users. VCs in the US have that patience. VCs in China don't. When VCs in China put money into a company, the first question is, how are you going to make money? And so entrepreneurs don't have the resource or the time to say, you know what, I'm not going to worry about a revenue model. I'm going to innovate on this product. I'm going to make this product as great as I can. And I'm going to have the support of a board and investors. I personally believe, in my experience, could be just my opinion, but long-term innovation and quick return on investment sometimes don't go hand in hand. If you want to really invest in R&D, if you really want to invest for the long run, you can't be thinking about how am I going to make money immediately. The reason why they copy, and this is again only my opinion, is because that's the fastest way to generate cash. If I copy Uber, I don't need to waste 3 years innovating the way Uber did. I'm just going to take it and I'm going to generate cash immediately. If I want to innovate, if I want to build Segway from scratch in China, that means for 5 years I have to put my own money and investors' money, and it may never come to commercialization. Are they willing to take that long-term approach? It's not, are they willing to take the risk? I don't believe that Chinese are risk-averse in the least bit.
I've heard some Chinese people say that they think that another factor that potentially can inhibit innovation is too much government involvement. Do you think, based on your experience looking at the entrepreneurial community in China, do you think, first of all, is the government really involved quite a bit? And secondly, is government involvement a positive factor, or does it have a negative impact?
I think in China, one of the challenges is that the government wants to help and wants to be a part of it, but sometimes it gets in its own way. And I think we have a few examples I think are quite interesting to share. The first one is actually the story about the joint venture. So Ken, you know this well. When the joint venture, Silicon Valley Bank, got the banking license, we had decided that the best place to locate our joint venture was going to be in the coolest part of Shanghai, where everybody wants to hang out. For the California or U.S. audience, you can think about that as like San Francisco, right? Let's put it in San Francisco because that's where everyone wants to be. It's the best place to get employees and get entrepreneurs to come join you.
Especially the young ones.
Especially the young ones,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, exactly.
And it's where the employees want to be,
Yes.
right? In China, like in most developing countries, industries are segmented in location. So in China, as you know, the technology companies are all in the Zhangjiang Technology Park. In relation to San Francisco, if we were to just mind map this, it would be like, you know, if San Francisco is the cool part, well, Zhangjiang Park is kind of like San Jose. In most companies, the CEO or the chairman makes a decision, maybe talking to the board or some advisors, about where are the customers, where are the employees, and where is the best commute, and what association do we want to have with our location, right? Well, we thought we were either going to be in San Francisco or in Oakland or in San Jose of China or of Shanghai. We ended up in Gilroy.
And who decided that?
The government. It wasn't the right place for our employees. It wasn't the right place for our customers. I remember talking to clients and saying, hey, why don't you come out and visit us in Yangpu District, Gilroy? And they said, you know what, why don't you tell us when you're back in the center of town? But this is an example of where government got in the way, right? They decided for us where they want us to be.
So would you say then it's a mixed blessing, that government involvement can go either way? If the government's not involved, they're not helping, but they're not hurting.
I think a lot of people are probably asking and wondering, with China now, having that kind of government support, having champions that you mentioned, like a Baidu, a Tencent, an Alibaba, a Huawei, that are going out globally, are they friends or foe?
Yeah.
Are they threats or collaborators?
So again, my personal opinion here, I don't represent Rocket Space's opinion nor Silicon Valley Bank's, but this is my personal opinion. There's a lot of questions of why PayPal didn't do well in China. There's a lot of questions of why eBay didn't do well in China, why Google had to leave China, why Facebook never got a chance to go into China. If you ask government officials, they'll say things like, well, you know, we didn't want Facebook to come in, or if Facebook came in, they'd have to do the back door for us, or they'd have to abide by our laws, and Facebook didn't want to abide by their laws, or Google didn't want to abide by their laws. But whatever the reason was, the eBay of China, Alibaba, the Google of China, Baidu, the Uber of China, Didi Kuaidi, are all doing very, very well. And their American counterparts in the country are suffering. Now, again, a lot of people could argue and say this has nothing to do with the government. I would say it's helping the industry. I think the government intervention and the government's ability to either hinder or keep out foreign competition is helping these companies. Now, how long that's going to last, I don't know. I don't believe it's going to last forever, because at the end of the day, product and customization and customer experience wins out, right?
Yeah. So this is a question I want to throw back at you, Ken. Just your experiences with these Chinese officials. Because I remember I had a similar experience. My first meeting with Chinese officials at the Ministry of Information and Industry, I felt like these were like school kids. We were telling them stuff that's happening in broadband wireless that they literally had no ideas of, right? But then what I realized was the second meeting I went, they were that much caught up. By the third, fourth meetings, they probably knew more good questions than I know how to answer, right? And so while the bureaucrats and the politicians seem to be behind, but my feeling was they caught up quick. Mm-hmm. And they always had a strategy behind what they were thinking.
Mm-hmm. My experience has been that the government officials, for the most part, particularly those that are higher up, do their homework. or they have somebody do their homework for them because they're remarkably well informed. Chinese government knew a lot about Silicon Valley Bank when they started encouraging us to come to China. So I don't think that there is any lack of knowledge. And if there is, they catch up quick. I agree with you. But I do think that government involvement is a two-edged sword. I think that often the government gets in the way in some of the ways that Armand was just describing. But I also think that the government can bring resources to bear that will help things accelerate. And I also think that as regards this whole issue of foreign competition, that the Chinese government, when it wants to, can do a very good job of preventing foreign companies from making progress in the interest of protecting their Chinese counterparts.
Would you agree, Ken, to interrupt you for a
Yeah.
second, that the U.S. government is very good at doing the same thing?
To a lesser extent. Can we go to intellectual property for a minute, though?
Sure.
Because we were talking about speed before.
Sure.
And one of the theories that I've heard from both Chinese and Americans, actually more from Chinese, is that Chinese companies feel the need to move quickly because there's relatively little in the way of intellectual property protection. So the best way to protect whatever it is you create is sort of two things. One is don't create in huge chunks, create incrementally, and then keep going as fast as you possibly can so you're always ahead of your competition. Do you think that's a part of it or not?
Ken, I think that's a U.S. mentality. I think in China, entrepreneurs understand that they're going to get copied by their peers, and so they also want to move fast. I'm not sure that's the main driver. I think that's probably one of the drivers. I'm not sure that's the main driver, but I do think that that's definitely a Silicon Valley five-man startup, five-woman startup approach, is that they need to not litigate but innovate.
So Armand, one of the things I'm interested in hearing about, and I think everybody else is too, how is entrepreneurship and innovation evolving in China right now? Where do you see it going?
Great question, Ken. I see a couple different angles here. First and foremost, in the U.S., what we're seeing is a shift to hardware. We're seeing a lot of companies coming out with physical products in the startup stage, whereas before you didn't see that a lot. Hardware 10 years ago in the US meant semiconductors, or it meant servers or server technology, and they were mostly B2B plays. What we're seeing today is that hardware is making a huge comeback in a consumer angle. 10 years ago at Silicon Valley Bank, we would have never wanted to give a loan to a consumer company that's building hardware because we were worried about what are they going to do on a Best Buy shelf, or how are they going to do inventory?
Give a couple of examples of what you're talking about.
Yeah, so today what we're seeing is physical products, consumer products in the hardware space that are being funded in Silicon Valley, where we didn't see
name a
that.
product.
So like Fitbit, for example,
Oh, I see.
or
Okay.
GoPro, or the competitors and the disruptors to these kinds of companies.
Right.
Whereas 10 years ago, you didn't see these companies getting funded because there was too much risk. We're also seeing drones, and we're seeing virtual reality. This is all a lot of hardware play that usually would never get funded in the past because consumer technology was very high risk. Now, what's really interesting is that China has the edge when it comes to hardware. The US has the edge when it comes to design. So what we're seeing is, whether it's through Kickstarter or through some of the crowdsourcing companies, is that there's a lot of design that's happening here, but the technical advantage and the manufacturing advantage is coming from China. And so companies like Xiaomi are able to take a product that is doing well, it has market viability, and outdo the US when it comes to price. A great example of that is the GoPro camera, right? So the GoPro camera in the US, it's a public company, is about a $400 camera with X, Y, and Z specifications. Xiaomi has been able to cut the price down to $79 and have double the specifications. And what we're going to see is that as the US continues to invest in hardware consumer product companies, China's going to have that edge when it comes to manufacturing. Part of the problem is that 5 men in a garage in the US designing a new hardware product that's consumer focused is going to have a hell of a time getting to China, to Shenzhen, and trying to manufacture that and having to learn through all the things that startups have. Whereas in China, they're able to do this obviously overnight with very little problems. So that's one angle where I think things are going to be shifting, where China has a huge edge and the US is very involved. The other thing that's happening is I spent a lot of time trying to figure out globally why large corporations have a difficult time innovating. And one of the things that it always comes down to is culture, as well as being able to attract talent. Well, in China, what we're seeing is that the largest companies, not the smaller ones, the largest companies are getting the really good talent. So if you're a really smart, bright engineer coming out of Fudan or Tsinghua, your first shot is to go work for Tencent, not necessarily to go work for a smaller company, right? And so you're seeing these larger companies, unlike in the US, get much more innovative. And what we're seeing is that Tencent today, with its WeChat product and its payment product, outdoing what we're seeing in the US with its WhatsApp or Facebook Messenger product.
I think everyone who's been to Silicon Valley is obvious to the fact that the talent here is not just American. They come from the world, right? The world's best talents come to Silicon Valley. What's China's, in your opinion, the ability of China to attract the world's best talent? Not just in China.
None.
Really? Wow,
None.
okay.
And I'll tell you why. I spent a lot of time thinking about diversity in entrepreneurship and innovation. I'm not going to get into diversity, but what I'll tell you is that the diversity you see in Silicon Valley is hugely important to the success of the companies. Your average startup team has a guy from Europe, Eastern Europe, India, China, Iran, Latin America, Brazil, all in one team working together. In China and places like India, it's very homogeneous, right? And one of the biggest challenges in China is language and the culture barriers, right? You know and I know that when you're in China and you go to a party and there's 10 Chinese and there's 2 foreigners, the 10 Chinese are in the corner talking amongst themselves and the 2 foreigners are in this corner talking amongst themselves.
Well, I feel like, can we just hit on the point of why we have this conversation, right? Is that even though they're all in China, you have these different groups, right, at the same party.
So how does
Sorry,
this
I'm being
work
hard on
then
you. That's
in
totally
terms of, and maybe you've already sort of answered it in a way, but Chinese and Americans collaborating versus competing. What would you say about that? It almost sounds like, based on the language problems, you're of the opinion that there is more competition than collaboration. But what would you say?
Language is a huge issue, as well as culture. And of course, I have a couple stories here. So when Silicon Valley Bank was getting ready to do the joint venture with Shanghai Pudong Development Bank, I had already been in China for a couple years, and I was really big on not just learning the language, but also learning culture and being sensitive to Chinese culture and making sure that when we're in these long meetings between both sides, that we're keeping our minds open about making sure that we're being polite and understanding of Chinese culture. I remember a very specific case where we were talking about the cooperation agreement between our 2 entities, and very specifically what each side had to offer. And our gentleman, I won't name names, had written in the agreement specifically what our side had to offer to the other side. Now remember, we're the Americans, we're sitting in Shanghai, we want to get into this cooperation agreement, and we're telling them what we had to offer. Now, backtracking for a second, I remember when I first started learning Chinese language, I was informed that in China, the word teacher, 老师, is very significant. The teaching relationship between teacher and student is very significant. You don't just take that lightly the way we might here in an American university where we would disagree with our teacher and raise our hand really high. In China, it's a much more subdued relationship. The teacher is the master, the student is the student. You don't disagree, you don't talk back. It's a very formal relationship. Teacher. So we were doing this agreement back between Silicon Valley Bank and Shanghai Pudong Development Bank. And our guy at Silicon Valley Bank had written exactly what we were going to provide from our side. And there was the English version and there was a Chinese version. And he had specifically written that we are here to teach you innovative banking. And that was translated, the word for teacher. And I could just see the other side, looking at us, saying, do you really think that you're going to come here and teach us? And you want to be the teacher and you want us to be the student? And I really believe that one incident set off the wrong tone. The mindset from our side was, let us come teach you so we could work together, so we can create something new. The mindset from their side was, wait a minute, are you saying that you're going to come in here and you're going to take the lead position already? Don't you think that we have something to teach you about China? Don't you think you have something to learn? And I really felt like I was sitting in the room. I was like, ooh, that didn't go over so well.
What about competition, right? Everybody's fearful about competition. And with a lot of Chinese companies going international, going global, coming here, you know, Alibaba made a $200 million investment in Snapchat, right? How is that competition going to shape out?
Can you be a little bit more specific? So when you mean competition, do you mean Chinese companies necessarily coming here?
Yeah.
I think China has really staked its expertise in the hardware arena. It's also staked its strength in payments, which is really dwarfed what we have here in the U.S. And really taken over in terms of globally what payments should look like. And also in terms of e-commerce and delivery, which China obviously with its large population has done really well. I think in these areas of strength, Chinese companies are going to do very well globally. I think the only reason why we're not seeing Xiaomi phones in the US today, the $99 Xiaomi phone, which is a very strong product, is because of IP litigation. Chinese companies, DJI drones, they rule the world, right? And I don't think that anyone is going to be able to beat what they can do. When we talk about virtual reality, when we talk about augmented reality, HTC is taking the lead on that. And I think while the US is going to continue to do well, Facebook with Oculus is going to continue to do well, I think that when it comes to these hardware consumer products, China's got the edge. So I think there's specific areas where China has shown a lot of strength, and I think it's going to do well. But of course, there's a lot of areas which it's fairly behind when it comes to life sciences and biotech, software. One thing that does not exist in China is software as a service. B2B software, enterprise software, that whole market, it's a $100 billion market in the US, does not exist in China. And unless a lot of things change, will never exist there. So China has a lot of room to grow, but it's areas where it's really strong. It's going to give the global landscape a run for its money.
So what can we learn from each other? What is something that you believe American entrepreneurs can learn from Chinese entrepreneurs and vice versa?
Yeah, I was giving this a lot of thought. I think back to the diversity, it's really important. As Ken mentioned, I've worked in the UK, India, Israel, China. I'm from Iran. I studied in Mexico. I've been to a lot of different places. We've done a lot of work in Southeast Asia with Silicon Valley Bank. One of the things everybody wants to know is, how do you build the next Silicon Valley? Everybody wants to be the next Silicon Valley. It's almost getting a cliche. And I think until places like China understand the diversity edge and advantage, I think that Chinese entrepreneurship and innovation is going to be at least one step behind. I think it's very important. Interestingly enough, back to diversity, the one country that got it right, which is even more diverse than in America, is Israel.
So let's look at it from the other point of view.
Yeah.
What can Americans learn from Chinese entrepreneurs?
Get to revenue faster. I think American investors, venture capitalists, they've been too patient for too long. And I think that, as we talked about in the beginning of the conversation, so we're kind of bringing it back to a closed loop here, is that there is you can't innovate at 100% and make revenues at 100% when you're a very young company. You don't have the resources. You can do that when you're Facebook, but you can't do that when you're a 5-person company. You either got to innovate or you got to revenue, right? One or the other. And I think Americans probably wait too long, and I think the Chinese go too quickly. And I think there's a balance there. And I think that business model innovation, revenue generation, revenue cash flow generation at an earlier stage than they're used to is something that the Americans can learn from China. I also think the hardware edge, although I think that China is really far ahead.
Well, anyway, Armand, it's been great having you today. This is really informative and helpful, and from the cutting edge, Armand's on.
Well, we've learned from each other, and I'm really glad to be here. It's been exciting, and I look forward to the future of this podcast. I think it's going to...
China 411.
The China 411 is going to go places.
Agree.
It's going to go
But
places.
we always make it interesting.
I like that. He just gave you your tagline, where we never agree, but we always make it interesting.
Yeah.
Great.
Thank you
so much.
Thank you.
Thank
you for
you
having
very
me.
much. Yeah,
Thank
thanks.
you. Thank you for having me.